Much, Francis, for the very kind introduction. Yes, so as Francis says, I will be doing the introduction to global fisheries governance and the international fisheries framework. Now, bearing in mind we only have an hour, this is very much an introduction, and we'll expand a lot more on this over the next couple of weeks, particularly when it comes to the various laws that are governing fisheries. And as we go through the thematic areas, we will raise those issues. So as we move into the more substantive part of the program, just want to make it clear that I like to teach, not to lecture, so I will ask you a lot of questions as we go on, and I hope that you will be happy to contribute and share your thoughts. Okay, great. So, start at the beginning. What is fisheries governance? A lot of you are working in fisheries management or governance, but what are we actually talking about here? What is the full picture? So, fisheries governance, if we're looking basically at the FAO definitions, is defined as the sum of the legal, social, economic, and political arrangements used to manage fisheries. It has international, national, local dimensions. It includes legally binding rules as well as customary social arrangements, right? Fisheries management, by contrast, is defined as the integrated process of information gathering, analysis, planning, consultation, decision-making, etc., implementation, enforcement of regulations and rules which govern fisheries activities. So, from your perspective, what are the main differences between fisheries governance and fisheries management from that definition, and from your own experience as well? What would you say? It's the main difference between those two concepts. Yes, at the back.
So yeah, I'm Bisha from the Department of Fishery Thailand. So from my understanding, the fishery governance is a framework to establish the effective fishery management. That's for me.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of the overarching framework, right? It's a much broader concept than fisheries management, which is sort of the technical implementation side of things, right? Yeah, I think that's spot on. So, when we're thinking of fisheries governance and we're trying to understand it, we need to understand not just the laws that obviously are being implemented and, with fisheries management procedures, but also we need to understand the social context, what is happening on the ground. We need to understand economic realities, and of course the political arrangements which are influencing the creation of laws and the management of fisheries. So yeah, it has all these different dimensions to it. We also need to understand who's involved in this process. So who are all the actors involved? Who are the stakeholders involved? What are the power dynamics at play? We'll talk about that a little bit later. And how are all these facets of, economic, social, legal, and political interconnected? Very important to understand that if we want to manage our fisheries effectively and holistically, and want to understand who should be involved and how we can devolve control in some areas, because fisheries is a complex system, right? Particularly when we think of marine fisheries, we have these huge ocean spaces beyond land, and they're pretty difficult to control. Even if you have, significant resources, they're still pretty difficult to control. We also have an abundance and a diversity of fisheries. We were talking about this a bit in our focus group yesterday. The massive diversity of fisheries in this region, and how, at the moment, stock assessment is covering only a fraction of those, because it's just, there is such diversity, it's just difficult, to fully understand everything that's going on. From a global perspective, we also have millions of fishes globally. And, of course, there's very complex ecosystems, which may be much more difficult to reach and study than those ecosystems on land. So, because of that, sometimes we need to go beyond this concept of control, which I think is very much inherent in a lot of fisheries management. How can we control people? How can we have the most effective monitoring, control, surveillance, and enforcement? But actually, when we're thinking of fisheries governance, we need to go beyond that mindset of how do we control people. We need to actually be thinking of what is happening, where can we devolve power, where can we trust people to actually potentially, manage themselves or work with us. Now, let's dive a little bit more into these 4 components that we talked about when it comes to fisheries governance systems. The political arrangements, the laws and regulations, the social elements, and of course the economic aspects. Now, there are many different aspects of each of these categories which need to be taken into account. And of course we also, like I said, need to think about the connections between these different aspects. How do they influence each other? So on the political side of things, of course, this is the big sort of overarching policy priorities. This is where these are set. This is where the sort of governance or the management is basically controlled from, right? This is where we set the big policy priorities. This is also where we might need to coordinate agencies and activities, not just at the national level, but at many different spatial scales. We probably need to enter into consultation and negotiation with stakeholders, maybe delegate powers. We also have pressures at this level from lobbies, maybe fisheries lobbies, right, the industry. Or on the other side, from advocacy groups, NGOs and so on, that want us to maybe focus more on environmental protection. And then, of course, at this level, we also have to think about governance failures and how this might affect our fishery system. Lack of political will, corruption, mismanagement, all of these elements, of course, are influencing, the political arrangements when it comes to fisheries. Then, of course, we have the laws and regulations. And this is where we're putting the big policy priorities into action. This is where we are, creating the laws, the enforcement powers, etc. And of course, that's a really important aspect, right? Because we have to be able to enforce our laws. We need to have clarity on what people can and cannot do. And we also need to consider all the different, again, spatial scales here. What's happening at regional level? What's happening at international level? What's happening at the national? What's happening at the local? Are there customary institutions that we need to take into account? That kind of thing. Potentially, we need to think of things like fisheries access arrangements. Perhaps, some of your countries have arrangements with other countries that allow them to fish in your waters, right? It's another form of legal agreement which is going to influence our fisheries and our fisheries governance. We create management entities, we need to have dispute resolution mechanisms, we need to have penalties, of course, and enforcement powers, and potentially we might also have to take into account, human rights law as well, depending on how our country is structured. So in South Africa, we have a constitution with a strong Bill of Rights, right to healthy environment, right to food, right to work. All of these influence our laws. So to the extent that this is influencing your laws, you might also have to take this into account. Social elements. This is where we go into the sort of local level, the small-scale fisheries, the fisheries communities. We have to take into account customary rules and cultural practices. We need to think about how to manage conflict between different aspects of the sector. We probably need to engage and consult with, the stakeholders when we are creating our policies and laws. We might need to do some capacity building and training, particularly if we want to implement new laws. For, small-scale fishers, for example, there might need to be some capacity building in order to implement those laws effectively. We need to take into account the livelihoods and food security that the sector provides, safety and well-being of fishers, and concepts such as equity and social justice. And then finally, we have the economic aspects, which of course is often driving our fisheries governance. How much money can we make from it? So profits, of course, how much money can we make from fishing? How much can we get in licenses and taxes as a government? What's happening with the markets? What's happening with trade? What's happening with value chains? Yesterday, Amy was talking about gender issues. A lot of women are working in the post-harvest sector and the pre-harvest sector of these value chains, but sometimes their work is not considered or taken into account. And again, ignoring that aspect of the sector means that you ignore a large part of the trade that's going on. We also need to think about things like fishery subsidies. We'll talk about this a bit more on day 6, but a huge part of the fishing industry is propped up by support. And this type of support for fuel, support for other types of costs, without which, you know, a lot of fishing would not be profitable. And so we also need to consider how this is affecting other elements of our governance system, how this affects our ability to manage our fishery sustainably. And then potentially we might also need to invest in infrastructure, processing plants, ports, fishing harbors, markets, whatever it might be. So I hope this gives you an idea of the complexity of fisheries governance, all the different elements that you need to understand, understand and also take into account when you are creating your fisheries management and governance policies, if, you know, the system is going to actually be effective. If you leave people out or leave elements out of your governance, if you don't have a full picture of your fishery system, it can be very difficult to actually create something which reflects conditions on the ground, which affects, you know, what's actually happening in reality, which does mean that effectiveness, of course, reduces. Now, all of you are working for government agencies. You know, of course, well, different government agencies, I should say, dealing with various aspects of fisheries. So, you know, I'm sure you understand that at least at national level, there are many different agencies working on different aspects of fisheries. You know, not just fisheries departments, Coast Guard, navies, port authorities, of course, labor ministries, customs, trade. All of these ministries and departments work on fisheries to some extent. But of course, some of you are also from regional bodies, regional fisheries bodies. You understand that you have this additional layer of governance and management happening at regional level. Then, of course, we have the international level as well, all of the agencies and IGOs and NGOs that are working as well on different aspects of fisheries management, and there are many of them. And then the local level, of course, the fishing communities, the fishers and vessel owners, etc. And then we have cross-cutting actors as well, so NGOs and activist groups, industry and fisheries lobbyists, academia and research bodies, and coordinating bodies. And all of these people are working on different aspects of fisheries, and a lot of the time not talking to each other. So obviously that leads to siloed approaches, and this is what Professor Francis was talking about yesterday. And this is what we do in CAPFISH. We try and sort of bring together all of these different, you know, aspects of fisheries, areas of fisheries, in order to be able to look at the fishery system as a whole, in order to understand all the different parts of it. But in reality, what's actually happening a lot of the time is that these agencies are not talking to each other and not coordinating, and that can lead to a lot of problems in terms of overlap of functions, sometimes conflicting functions, yeah. Okay, so I hope that gives you an idea of what a fisheries governance system is at its core, all the different people involved, all the different elements involved, which a lot of it I'm sure you already know. So now I want to look at this from a more practical perspective. You, as government officials, particularly working in fisheries, are trying to achieve certain goals with your fishery system, right? Or your country is trying to achieve certain goals with your fishery system. They might be economic, or environmental, or social, but, you know, all of you have some idea of sort of the optimum fishery system, right? Now, fisheries governance, of course, is not, I mean, it's a fairly new concept. As little as 150 years ago, even less, scientists saw the ocean as inexhaustible, and they didn't see that there was any need for fisheries governance, right, or comprehensive fisheries governance. Maybe a little bit of management in certain fisheries, but certainly not on a sort of broad scale like we have today. But of course, as we know, industrialization and the injection of huge levels of capital in the form of fisheries subsidies particularly has significantly improved our ability and capacity to overfish the oceans. And this has, of course, led to adoption of policies which seek to privatize the ocean, things like quotas, for example, giving you essentially the right to own a certain number of fish, that you can catch a certain number of fish. But, this is often focused, at least in the past, on profit at the expense of social benefit. And, more recently, of course, we've been trying to conserve the fish stocks, so then we've been more focused on the environmental. And then only extremely recently have we started to focus more on the social, particularly starting to adopt more and more co-management policies for small-scale fisheries. This is, more of the very recent past that this has been sort of in vogue to adopt co-management for small-scale fisheries. But in general, these days, very few fisheries are not governed by some type of management system, a government system, a community system, or some other type of system. But of course, we know that fishery systems are complex, as I mentioned, and ultimately, the ideal would be to strike a balance between the environmental, the economic, and social, but that's not always possible in practice. So, going back to what I said at the beginning of this section, if you're thinking about your fisheries in your country, what would you like to achieve? What would your country like to achieve? If you could have this sort of ideal, what would you like to achieve in your fisheries? Maybe, you want to make more money from your fisheries. You want to focus on the economic. Maybe you want, healthier ecosystems, or maybe you would like, to focus on creating employment or something. So if you think about it, just take a few minutes and think about it. What outcomes would you like to achieve in your fishery system, in your ideal fishery system in your country? Take a few minutes, think about it, and then maybe you can share some of your ideas about what would you like to achieve. Yeah? Everybody? Everybody okay to take a few minutes? Yeah? So what do you think? Would anyone like to share? If you had your way, what would you like to achieve? What's the sort of number one goal you'd like to achieve in your fisheries? Or, multiple goals.
So from my personal perspective, I believe the goal to achieve the fishery government is about to maximize the fishery resources utilization, and while we maximize the use of utilization, we also ensuring the sustainable exploitation of the resources, as well as the engagements of all relevant stakeholders. For me.
Okay, so you are focusing on economic. You want to sort of maximize the economic while ensuring that the
and
fisheries are
also
sustainable.
ensuring the engagement from the social community as well.
Okay. So you want to have a sort of balance between all three.
Yeah, I will balance three pillars.
Okay, good. Thanks. Anyone else? Have a different vision for your fisheries?
Hello, good morning. Percival from Malaysia here. In our country, we are focusing on, of course, sustainable fisheries. and then food safety for our people, and then food security or food availabilities, and also good management throughout the coastal and also deep sea fishing in our country. So these are the main mission for our fisheries department in Malaysia. Thank you.
Can you just talk a little bit about the status of your fisheries in Malaysia? Because I didn't have anyone in my group yesterday from Malaysia. So,
Okay, so in Malaysia, I would like to share two scenarios because I will be talking about two regions here, Peninsular Malaysia and also in Borneo. So basically in Peninsular Malaysia, we have this Department of Fisheries of Malaysia who have, I believe, 14 regional or state fisheries managers, sorry. And then those 14 fisheries district officers will control and manage all the fisheries activity in different states in Malaysia. So if we look at 10 years back, we can sadly say that our current stock will be declining for several species because in Malaysia we have multi-species. We have thousands of species of fauna and flora. So we have almost more than 10 fisheries management action plans, different FMA, FMPs, and besides of food security, that's becoming a very important factor for us to make sure our people get protein, source of protein. And then when we look into this Borneo in Sarawak, basically, we do have two different fisheries managers, which is the Department of Marine Fisheries and also Department of Agriculture. So basically in Sarawak, the fisheries divided into two sections. One is the freshwater, who is managed by the state, by the Sarawak state itself, and then for this marine, managed by the Department of Marine Sarawak. And then those two managers actually have different ways of management because one of them are reporting to different bosses and also top managers because we have different stockholders, especially for the international level. And then if we look into this status, we are talking about status in Sarawak, it will be more to coastal fishing that develop better than deep fishing in Sarawak. Because nowadays, for these 2 years back, we have problems in diesel subsidies that those big vessel managers from deep fishing, they tends to turn back and change into coastal fishing. So they left this deep fishing business and then they select coastal areas to fish. So that's what's happening in Sarawak and also Malaysia.
okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing. Yeah, okay, so I see that the focus in Malaysia is on, social sustainability, food security, but obviously trying to conserve the resources for that purpose, I assume.
Yes,
Yeah.
correct.
Okay, thanks. Anyone else like to share? One more person like to share what their vision is? Yes?
Thank you. My name is Andreas from Indonesia. Uh, so, the things that Indonesia would like to achieve is that the blue economy. So, there are three main goals from Indonesia. The first one is protecting the marine environment. This is to make sure that there are always plenty of fish in the sea, protecting the sea life and heal important habitats like coral reef and mangrove. And second one is improving the fishers' lives of welfare to help local fishermen and coastal communities earn a better income, work in fair conditions, and have a better quality of life. And the last one is the food security to create new job and money for the country in a responsible way. That's from Indonesia. Thank you.
Thanks so much for sharing. It's interesting because I know that Indonesia, you've done a huge expansion of your fisheries, obviously for economic, but also for social purposes. So I guess perhaps now that that's been done, maybe the focus is more on the environmental and the social. Yeah, interesting. Okay, thanks so much for sharing. You were going to talk about the reality of achieving these in a minute, but yeah, good to hear your sort of visions. And you know, I've just put up some other factors that maybe, you know, as a country you might consider as objectives when you're trying to sort of manage your fisheries and the types of issues you might want to focus on. And I think probably, you know, a lot of these were inherent in what you were talking about: healthy fish stocks, healthy ecosystems, poverty prevention, food security, and so on. There's just a couple maybe that were not really mentioned. Safe and healthy fishes. Are you concerned about safety in your fisheries? Yeah. Anyone have any comments on that? Is this a sort of overarching goal or just a sort of side goal? Yeah.
And also we have basic safety training for the fishers.
Okay. What about the Cape Town Agreement? Is Indonesia going to ratify that?
Yeah, we have ratified the Cape Town Agreement as well.
Have you? Okay. Okay, good. All right. What about independence from foreign interests? Anyone? I know that Indonesia has already done that. Any other countries that have foreign fleets in your waters and you want independence from them? Is this a concern? No, not a concern in this region. Okay, what about cultural practices? Retaining cultural practices. This can also be quite a important idea in fisheries. I mean, perhaps more in developed countries, but anyone here concerned about retaining the cultural practices of the fisheries? No, this is not a big overarching concern either. It's more social issues, food security. Yeah, okay. Different issues in different regions, that's for sure. All right, so just to go over some of the models that countries have adopted when it comes to their fisheries governance. Not generally throughout the entire fishery system of a country. A lot of the time, there's different models that are adopted for different types of fisheries. For example, profit-driven models often are adopted for industrial fisheries, whereas socially driven models are often adopted for small-scale fisheries. But these are just some of the types of models that countries have adopted over the years in order to manage their fisheries. So neoliberal models, for example, those are quotas. You know, when you provide quotas, like I mentioned earlier, you provide some sort of ownership over the ocean or a certain number of fish. And this is in response to this idea of the tragedy of the commons. You all know what the tragedy of the commons is? Anyone not know what that means? Okay. No response. Okay. I'm gonna assume you know this idea of the tragedy of the commons, that, you know, when you have a common resource, then people will take more than they should and not cooperate and so on. And so this kind of idea is in response to that principle. However, you know, in reality, we see that that idea is often not playing out in practice. So a lot of the time we are seeing in fisheries, and other sectors as well, customary indigenous community systems that are managing the fisheries pretty well, or managing the commons pretty well. But anyway, this idea of neoliberalism, it works on this sort of, idea that increased profit and increased ownership of resources will promote better environmental stewardship. In reality, this doesn't always happen, because as soon as you impose a profit motive, this can, of course, lead to unsustainable practices. You give someone a quota, and then they're catching a lot of bycatch, or whatever it might be, and they might be dumping that extra catch because, or they might be underreporting so they can get more. So, this doesn't always work in practice. Then we have this idea of resource nationalism. This is, I think, what Indonesia adopted, for sure, when the government starts to exert significant control over fisheries resources in a country to increase economic benefits to that country. Prioritizing national fishes over foreign fishes, and significantly investing in the fishing industry, which has social benefits in the short term, but of course, in the long term, if you prioritize investment and profit over conservation, this can lead to problems. So perhaps this is why you're not prioritizing conservation and social issues. Then we have these socially driven systems, things like customary institutions. Generally, these institutions already exist. They've existed over generations, or been built up over generations by local fishing communities, developing customary rules and practices. Often these integrate, the social, environmental, and cultural pretty well. And, as a government, generally, because these systems already exist, it's more about recognizing these systems and supporting these systems than actually creating any of these systems. And then obviously this gives a lot of benefits, It can reduce management burdens, of course, to recognize these systems, promote compliance in fisheries, or self-compliance. But of course, if you are seeing significant changes from things like climate change or economic modernization, like, we're putting bigger engines on boats now, or whatever it might be, then these customary rules and practices might not work as well anymore. But, where they work, you can recognize them as a way to reduce management burdens as a government. Then, of course, we have co-management. Now, co-management, of course, is it's co-managing, as it says, between the government and the fishers. And this can span a whole range of different approaches, anything from we just consult fishers to we actually devolve the power to manage the fisheries to the fishers. And the rationale, of course, for this, again, it's the same kind of thing. We reduce the management burdens, but also, involving fishing communities and managing resources does promote trust, does promote better compliance. It also allows you to incorporate traditional knowledge in your fisheries management. It's an additional source of data, and it can improve social outcomes as well. But, this requires significant investments. So, training might be required, consultation obviously is required, and sort of careful structuring and planning. And this is not appropriate for every single situation. And then finally, we have environmentally driven models of management. So, ecosystem-based fisheries management, of course. We talked about that yesterday. I know there's experts on that in the room. And that's, of course, moving away from this idea of single species management. And, this is a good approach because you are looking at the system in a holistic way. And that's including, of course, the human element as well. So we're not ignoring the fishers in all of this. But I think, as we saw at least as I saw in my group yesterday as we were discussing, it's quite hard sometimes to transition from single species management to a very holistic ecosystem-based management approach because it requires a lot more data, a lot more resources, and sometimes countries just struggle to, meet those sort of requirements for EBFM. But it is something that can be sort of incorporated gradually. And I think that what CFDEC is doing is pretty good in that regard with the training and so on. And then, of course, we have market-based fisheries management, also that came up in our panel yesterday. This idea of certifying fish, tracing fish, maybe putting trade restrictions on fish. Of course, you know, some of you have had to deal with these yellow cards from the EU, right? Or, you know, something similar from the US, perhaps. Basically saying that if you want to import to our countries, you need to, you know, comply with certain environmental rules on EU fishing, or what was the other one? The turtle excluded devices as well. So yeah, so these are the types of, this is type of market-based fisheries management that countries have adopted, where essentially you base it on market forces, and it can be administered by governments in the cases of catch documentation schemes, or private entities, for example, in the case of these eco-labels. And, you know, the rationale, of course, is to improve sustainability and environmental outcomes. Slowly, some of these entities are adopting policies to try and reduce forced labor in fisheries as well. But in practice, this has mixed results. And it excludes many small-scale fisheries, unfortunately, from, you know, particularly things like certification. And so, you know, this does exclude often small-scale fisheries from international markets, not because they're fishing unsustainably, just because they can't necessarily meet the high reporting requirements. And like I said, in many countries, multiple governance mechanisms are used across fisheries and areas. And of course, in developing countries, there's often this added element that you're getting aid and assistance from outside to, well, from other countries, from NGOs, from IGOs, UN agencies, to essentially implement these systems, and that obviously adds a layer of complication as well. So earlier, of course, we were talking about the ideal fishery system. Now let's talk about the barriers to the creation of an ideal fishery system, particularly issues of power dynamics within fishery systems. Who has the power in your fishery system? Who has more power than others? Whose voices are amplified over others? And how does that affect your ability to actually achieve the goals that we were talking about earlier? So, does that make sense? Everyone want to take a few minutes, maybe talk to your fellow countrymen? Where are the sticking points in your system? Where are the problems? Who is controlling everything? Whose voice is amplified in your systems? And how does that affect your ability to achieve those goals that we talked about earlier? Yeah, everybody take a few minutes and think about it, and then we're going to share. Okay, anyone want to share? Maybe someone we haven't heard from before? Anyone from the Philippines want to share on this issue? Yeah?
So, good morning. I'm Myra from the Philippines. So, with regards to the power dynamics of fisheries system, in the Philippines, for the power dynamics, the national government that is responsible for the fisheries policy and then the licensing, the enforcement, and the resource management is the Bureau of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources, which is under the Department of Agriculture. So they are the lead agency with regards to the enforcement of the illegal and unreported against IUU fishing. And as part of the Philippine Coast Guard, we are just a deputized agency. So together with BIFAR, we combat illegal fishing through apprehension and enforcement of the law, which is anchored from the Republic Act 8550 or the Fisheries Code, but was amended by RA 10654 or the law on more on focusing on the IUU fishing. But on the another power dynamics, aside from BIFAR, we have the local government units. So within the 15 kilometers municipal waters, the jurisdiction is under the local government units. So it is headed by our municipal mayors. And then they have policies or resolutions which they decided if what penalties or fines would they inflict to the fishers who violated, because under RA 8550, commercial fishers are not allowed to enter or use the resources within the municipal waters, which is 15 kilometers. So commercial fishers is only allowed after 15 kilometers. So within 15 kilometers, they can be apprehended, they can be caught by, they will be liable for offense. So that's why municipal fishers is they are protected by the law, so that it will the resources will be maintained, and it's also for their sake they will not be what you call that, they will not be the local fishers or the municipal fishers will not be overexploited by the commercial fishers. That's why. So, and then with regards to, as but, but there are instances, especially in the recent, in the recent happenings in the Philippines, there is this commercial fishers that were allowed to fish within the 15 kilometers, provided that the water is in 7 fathoms, but it is an isolated case. It was just only one case for that. But before, as of now, they are really implementing based on the RA 8550 that only commercial fishers are allowed to fish beyond 15 kilometers. So that's all. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for sharing. So, how does that help you achieve or how does that affect your ability to achieve your objectives for your fisheries? That system where BIFAR has control over everything, and the municipalities make their own laws. How do you think that affects, your sort of goals?
Well, it really greatly affect our goal in fisheries, because ultimately, I believe our goal is to have a sustainable fisheries. So in order to have a sustainable fisheries, we should have a law that regulates the resources, so that it will not lead to overexploitation. That's why it will the policy that has been established in the Philippines is a good basis and guideline, so that it will promote a sustainable fisheries. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, so you're saying that the power dynamic system or the power dynamics in that case are actually beneficial for achieving your goals. Okay, thanks. Would anyone else like to share? Anyone else have other ideas on, who has the power in your country when it comes to fisheries and how that's affecting your goals? Can you bring the microphone here, please? Hi. Sorry, can you bring the microphone there? Thank you.
Thank you. As law enforcement officer, so for Timor-Leste, the government is focusing on the blue economy. So the power is from the cabinet of the maritime frontier, I think. So I think the former fishery, the Ministry of Fishery, they're starting with the small-scale fishing, but a lot have to be done, as you mentioned before, to develop the infrastructure, port. So this is important to facilitate the small fishing scale. And I think what we are prioritized in Timor-Leste is like to face the combat illegal fishing, because not as I mentioned that we just start from the very small scale fishing, not even the semi-industry or fishing industry. So it's important to have the locals in our ocean, so that to provide information. As I mentioned, as we have the community-based reporting system that can provide the amount of fish that caught in our EZ, and also provide information in regards to the illegal activities in our ocean. Thank you.
Okay, good. So you're working with your small-scale fisheries there. You think the small-scale fisheries have sort of some power, some influence over government? Or is it just something that government is trying to do to ensure food security and so on?
Yeah, as we discussed yesterday, as that development of the fishery in our country, I think in the past is very underdeveloped, using very traditional fishing gear. So we don't have really historical with the fishing. So that's why with the government goal for the blue economy, to start with a small scale fishing, I think it will go and start slowly. As I think you mentioned before about the foreign fishing vessel. I think we contracted also foreign fishing vessels several years ago. But what we need to see is that the implementing of the MCS, because before we don't have really good laws and rules. So MCS wasn't implemented well, and then we identified some illicits and then stopped, suspended. So I think we are now starting from very low level, so that we can go up. Thank you.
Okay, interesting. Thanks so much for sharing. Is anyone dealing with any problems from lobbying from the fishing industry or overseas interests that's influencing your fisheries? Any distant water fleets, any sort of industrial fishing lobbyists trying to get higher quotas or more lax fishing regulations? Anyone dealing with this problem? No one wants to share? This is politically sensitive.
Yeah, Kathleen. I'm work with another province, not in Bangkok, in another province near to Bangkok. So I saw some problem about between large scale commercial feed and with small scale fishery. That added like a power dynamic of that point is like the large commercial feed, like the big company have more how to say capital, politic and have like a more decision making. Yeah, and also they can bargaining the price of the fish more than small scale fishery. And that one is as a result, simple, policy may favor industrial fishing interest, like they have quota allocation more than small scale, and also they can have like a fishing zone in the Gulf of Thailand, yeah, more than how to say artisanal, yeah, and also small scale fishermen may have like a limit the budget and also limit the technology to go beyond of the coastal area. And technology also the resources competition can increase the over decline fishery stock. So that one is the problem between large scale and small scale fishery.
Yep, thanks so much. That is a common problem for sure. Problems between industrial and small scale, because the industrial, of course, is bringing in more money, so a lot of the time they are prioritized over the small scale. So great. So I think continue to think about these issues as we go through. You know, obviously this is just the introduction to fisheries governance. We have a lot more in-depth presentations on various facets of this as we go on, but I think keep this in the back of your mind as you go forward, and think about how a lot of the issues that we are dealing with over the next 8 days might actually affect you know, how you can achieve goals of fisheries governance in your country. So I've been given a 5-minute warning, so I'm just going to quickly not talk about that. I'm going to quickly talk about the international legal framework, just very, very short introduction to this framework. And as I said, we'll go into a lot more detail on a lot of these laws over the next few days. So a lot of these fisheries laws, a lot of the international legal framework is voluntary when it comes to fisheries. There's a few binding conventions, but primarily it is voluntary. So that obviously has, you know, benefits and drawbacks. Benefits, of course, you can implement at your own pace. It's more flexible. You can, you know, adapt it to your own country's context. But on the other hand, of course, you don't have to implement it. So, you know, that's obviously the drawback of it. But, you know, some of these voluntary instruments in fisheries have actually been very influential, particularly something like the FAO Code of Conduct on Responsible Fisheries. So just because something is voluntary doesn't mean that it doesn't have importance and weight. Another important thing is international law, of course, only provides minimum standards. So, you know, you can certainly go beyond them, but in general, it's not always enough to, you know, have a effective fisheries governance. It's just kind of a starting point. But of course, it can provide really useful guidance when you are developing your fisheries governance and management. And this is just an overview of the timeline of the international legal framework for fisheries. So over the last 50 years, this is how fisheries law is developed at international level. I'm sure many of these conventions you already know. We sort of start with the sort of broad overarching conventions, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, the FAO Code of Conduct, as I mentioned, you know, of course, kind of broad principles on fisheries and law of the sea. We also have the FAO Compliance Agreement created in 1993, which was trying to essentially improve flag state control over fishing vessels. But as I'm sure many of you know, flag state control in both the fishing and the shipping industry is pretty poor, particularly because of things like flags of convenience, so it hasn't been that effective. And then, of course, there's the United Nations Fish Stocks Agreement, which you know, is the basis for the creation of many regional fisheries management organizations. And then as we go on, the laws become more numerous and more specific, often giving effect to specific elements of these broader conventions. So we have a number of conventions and guidelines on safety and labor. We have the small-scale fisheries guidelines. We have the Port State Measures Agreement, which I'm sure many of you are aware of, trying to prevent IUU fishing through port state control. We have voluntary guidelines on flag state performance, on catch documentation schemes, on transshipment. Of course, we have SDG 14, which, you know, has a lot on fisheries, a lot of targets on fisheries. And then most recently, we have the Agreement on Fisheries Subsidies, which of course we'll be talking about next week. And just for your sort of interest, I have separated these laws into binding laws. So these are all the binding conventions, and these are the voluntary guidelines. And as you can see, there's a lot more voluntary guidelines than there are binding laws. So we won't go over the impacts of a legal framework right now, but I have included, essentially a summary for you of the main impacts of this framework at international, regional, national, and local level. But it's really just a summary because, as I said, we'll be going through this in a lot more detail over the next 8 days. So that's me. Thank you for your attention.